Hey book buddies, how's it going? I wanted to make a book chat video because it's been a while since I've done a book chat video, and I have thoughts, I have feelings and ideas about like the reading life that I don't get to talk about like in my normal sort of like book wrap-up videos or when I'm talking about specific projects. So I thought it'd be good to do a video chatting about this. And I'd love to know your thoughts about it and start up some conversations in the comments below, or if you have your own booktube channel, if you want to make a response video, because I think it's so fascinating. But this will be a rambling, chatty video, so if you're not into it, then that's fine. But if you are, then like get comfortable, because I'm just gonna sort of ramble on for a while. So this is an issue that I've been contemplating for like quite a while. Like I've been running my book blog for 4.5 years or so, and I've been making videos for this channel for a 1.5 years, and something that keeps coming up is I find that if I respond to a book really negatively, that gets a lot more attention than if I respond positively. And I've always thought that's interesting and wonder why it is. Like, why do you think that is? I mean, I think it's partly because when we read or listen to a review of a book that we haven't read, we don't really have any context for understanding it unless it's like been up for a book prize, or if it's been a really popular book that's sort of like a buzz book that everybody's talking about, then we don't really know anything about it and have any context for it. So maybe it's sort of like when you go out in public, like if you're on a bus and a couple is sitting behind you and they're all lovey-dovey and you're just sort of like, whatever. But if you overhear that couple start arguing with each other and you hear a woman like really laying into a man about why he's such a weasel, like you're gonna start listening. Your attention will perk up. I mean, you'll be looking out the window and pretending you're not listening, but like you'll really be listening, because it's human nature. Like we have a lurid fascination with drama, and that's fine. But if you're just sort of like, I liked this book, there's nothing that special about it, then there's not much interest there. So in a way, it seems natural that videos like worst books of the year or this is the worst book that I've ever read, like those videos will get a lot more attention and a lot of views than some other videos that are praising books. But obviously we're all here on BookTube because we love books, or I presume that's why most of us are here. So I just wonder sometimes like why we're so drawn to negative reviews. Is it because we need like balanced opinion? I think that's good and healthy. And we get so many book recommendations that maybe it can feel like a relief sometimes to feel like, phew, I don't have to bother reading that book. Now for me in particular, I'm overwhelmingly positive about books, and I wonder sometimes like, should I give more balanced criticism or be more critical about what I'm reading? Like, do you find it annoying that I'm so positive, or does it just become bland after a while? And I've had people, like friends of mine in real life, say to me like, surely everything you read can't be that good. And one friend of mine said to me like, I don't read your reviews because I assume that you're just positive about things, so publishers will send you free copies. Which is so insulting. And like, A, I have a job and I make plenty of money. Like I can buy books if I want to, and I frequently do. And B, there's a lot easier ways to spend my time and to be able to get free books rather than just spending hours and hours trying to articulate my thoughts about a book. There's just such easier ways to do that. And I'm not just trying to curry favor with publishers, because without a doubt, like with almost every publisher, there's been a book of theirs that I haven't liked, and I'm not afraid to say so. So when my friend said that, I just got so angry. Anyway, partly why I'm so positive about books is because I genuinely enjoy so many of the books that I read. And I think that is partly because over the years, I've become a much more discerning reader about what books I'll pick up. Usually before even starting a book, I'll have an idea about whether that's a book I'll connect with or not. Of course, I don't always get it right, and I'll go into some examples in a minute about books that I really didn't connect with. And partly my reviewing style is like a layover from my academic days because I did a master's degree in studies in fiction. I've spent a lot of time taking books apart and trying to think about why they're put together the way that they are. Now, I don't fully agree with an academic style of reading. Like, I think I was a really bad student in some ways. And partly I didn't enjoy the MA because I don't enjoy the theory, the like Russian formalism or whatever, like trying to apply a theory and a structure to like how we read books. Rather than looking at the book itself and seeing what the book says, finding like a way to classify books, that really turns me off. Novels, in their very name, are always an original work by a specific author, and they should be read that way, rather than ticking boxes like this book fits in this genre or this book expresses these tropes. But I do have a specific way of reading which is different from how some other people read. And I think this might be partly relevant to some discussions which have been going on BookTube recently about reader fatigue or sort of like conflicted feelings about Goodreads or star ratings, etc. I do want to say first that I don't judge how anyone reads a book, and I'm not trying to be prescriptive, like this is how you should read a book. Like, obviously you should read a book however you please. It's your time and your money. If you feel like I didn't like this book because I didn't like this character, or this book was fine but nothing special, like that's perfectly valid. But I think some people's way of reading, or a possible reason why readers are getting so stressed or put off, is because in our social media culture, like we're all talking about books on BookTube and on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and like all those, and Goodreads and all those social media venues, is that we've developed more of a self-consciousness in our reading style. And like, as we're reading a book, or like before we even started reading a book, we've already started thinking that like, I need to form an opinion about this, or like how am I going to rate this book? Because we're aware that like I need to make a response to this book, like how am I going to say I feel about this book? And I think that can totally undermine the pleasure of reading and make us less receptive to why this particular book is so unique. Now, I read a passage in a novel recently which really spoke to me about this. And so I'm gonna read it out to you. It's from Lionel Shriver's The Standing Chandelier. And so I'm going to read it out to you because I think it's really relevant. The impulse to appraise was deeply ingrained. This knee-jerk need to no sooner see, hear, taste, or read a thing than to determine how good it was. The fashioning of an opinion was almost synonymous with apprehension of the item in question, so that you hardly had a chance to take something in before you got busy deciding what you thought of it. As if failure to come up with an instantaneous verdict made you remiss or slack-witted. So Frisk's, often whimsical contrivances had given him practice at detachment. Surely there was something to be said for simply looking without immediately going to work on an estimation, as if you were expected to value the article at hand for insurance purposes. And I think that's so good and like says so much about like why we get stressed about like the reading process, or why we can start to feel like a detachment from what we're reading, or why like our excitement about reading might be waning. What do you think? I mean, it's also like no doubt because just as readers and as people in the world, we have other things going on in our lives. And so, you know, obviously in any reader's life, there's going to be life things that happen which are going to distract and really like color your reading experience. And that's another thing. I mean, our responses to books are so influenced by what's going on in our life or what's happening in society in general. Like about over a year ago, I had read Colson Whitehead's novel, The Underground Railroad. And when I read that at the time, I made a wrap-up video, and as I was talking about it, I was like crying. It's like sort of embarrassing looking back on it now, like how emotional I got. but that was partly because at the time the US elections were happening, and this novel in particular says so much about manifestations of racism in our society, and we were witnessing the transition from an Obama administration to the current president. And obviously I was really emotional and terrified and depressed. And I'm sure if I read The Underground Railroad now, like I would still think it has a lot of literary quality and have an emotional reaction to it, but it wouldn't be, you know, quite so raw as it was then. Anyway, that was a tangent, but what I was trying to say and what I was trying to get at was that when I pick up a book, my way of reading it is not like, what do I think about this book, but like, what is an author trying to say here? And reading it, being open to the author's intentions and trying to figure out like, why did this author spend like weeks or probably months or like years writing out this thing, trying to artistically form a response to all these ideas that they're having. So I just have a lot of empathy for the work that authors have done and try to be sympathetic with what they've created. And I'm not saying that negative reviews don't do that. A lot of negative reviews do carefully consider the author's intentions and decide that they weren't successful in what they were trying to do. But then I see other negative reviews that seem to be saying, this author isn't doing what I want them to be doing, or the book isn't saying what I wanted to say. Does that distinction make sense? Like I said, it's a reader's own time, so you can read a book however you want. But personally, I so enjoy the process of really trying to understand why an author wrote the book the way that they did. You know, it's like a puzzle or a mystery, and it's like peering into an individual's imagination in a way that you can't do in like normal life. And when I ask myself, what is an author doing here? Why did they put the book together this way? Questions like star ratings or giving a score to a book just start to seem so absurd. I mean, it's meaningless. And I love this anecdote that Joyce Oates gave in an interview once. Like, if you know me, like I always bring JCO into whatever discussions about books I'm having. And I think one thing is that like Joyce Oates, like she's really underrated for her humor. Like, you know, JCO, the stand-up comic. Anyway, she related this metaphor about writing a novel, and she likened it to crossing a river. And she described how, you know, you come up to a river and it seems quite calm and peaceful at first, so you think like, oh, that won't be too hard to cross. And so you enter the river and you start going across, and it's okay at first, but then like you notice that the current starts coming along and taking you, and it starts getting very turbulent, and you start swimming to get to the other side, and as the waves are crashing over you, you start desperately trying to get the other side, and you're pushing your way through, and you get to the opposite shore finally, and you claw your way up the sand, and you're gasping for breath, and you stand up. Phew, finally you've made it. And the first thing that you see, of course, is a critic. And the critic says, now I wouldn't have done it that way. I wouldn't have made those mistakes. And she says that's why she thinks that critics are much happier people than authors. But I think it's true, and that's why I try to be so sympathetic with what authors are doing, because I know it like was such a struggle to create this book. And if I have something negative to say, I try to balance it out with something more positive. Now, it doesn't always work, and sometimes authors write bad books, and yes, I'm gonna dish some dirt here. So a few reasons why I might hate a book. Is hate too wrong a word? Why dislike a book? No, let's go with hate. Reason why I might hate a book is because I think an author has chosen to purposely withhold what they were really trying to say, or not fully explored the complexity of their central idea. So case in point, First Love by Gwendolyn Riley, and I can't go into the reasons why I despise this novel so much because I've talked about it on my channel multiple times. It's a hateful novel that purposely withholds trying to give you avenues into understanding the characters and their situation. And I don't hate it because the characters are awful or awful to each other. There are plenty of novels that I've read that have hateful characters who are really awful, but I still appreciate them, like the novel When I Hit You. It's fascinating considering why a woman might stay in an abusive relationship, and When I Hit You does this so brilliantly. And it's fascinating considering why people might act in a racist way or be hateful to their mother. Like in the novel A Line Made by Walking by Sara Baume, this character is like really cruel to people and to her mother in a similar way to First Love. But Sara Baume like writes about these characters in a way that you feel like you really understand her central character. But First Love gives you nothing but bile. And Jennifer, in her channel, Insert Literary Pun Here, was so funny about this novel in her video about what she thought were the worst books that she read last year. She said something like, some people say there's so many different ways of interpreting this novel. And it's like, yeah, of course, because there's nothing there. That was awesome. And I don't totally agree with all the disses she made of books in that video, but she is someone who is so smart and thoughtful in how she critically appraises books that I love that. Anyway, a second reason why I think a book might be unsuccessful is when an author is not writing out of an urgency of having something to say or trying to connect with a reader, but out of a desire to write a great work of fiction, or out of this sort of like pretentious conception that I am an author, that they utterly neglect to give their writing any heart. So second example, Tom McCarthy. And I think this author actually said when he was writing his novel Satin Island that he actually confined himself in a room for like months and months and just stared at a blank wall while writing this. And that really comes across in the writing, and it seems like an author who is just sitting there like I'm gonna write a great book and staring at this blank wall and not really having a like idea that he was dying to get out, but just that like he wanted to write a great book. And this novel, Satin Island, is so much a book of like ideas that in a way it doesn't feel like a novel. Like, why not just write essays? But the experience of reading this wasn't unpleasant. Like, I enjoyed parts of it and thought a lot of those ideas were quite interesting. Although the book was stricken with this particular kind of masculine sense of humor, which I particularly despise. But parts were fun and interesting, and I'm not saying an author who like writes in that way, who confines himself in a room and just tries to produce a work of fiction like that, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, there's another author called Nadeem Aslam, who's one of my favorite authors, and he's like notorious for like locking himself away for months or years trying to write a book and completely depriving all of his senses to write this book. And his books are so beautiful and like have so much feeling in them. And I'd really encourage you to read him if you haven't. I think his most famous novel is Map for Lost Lovers. Anyway, a third reason why I might hate a book is because it's outright prejudiced. Like, not what the characters are doing in the novel, but the author. It feels like the author is being prejudiced, like racist or homophobic or sexist. And like, that seems pretty unambiguous, doesn't it? But although it is like tough to call, because like can you can say like it might be the author or it might be the characters, and that can get really muddled in the style of narration. And people do really question what it means when you say a book is prejudiced, because like I did this video several months ago about how we should read problematic classics, and I got so many negative responses to that video. Like I got a lot of positive and really like interesting responses as well, of people really taking on that question, but then some other like responses that were like hugely negative. And I guess that was fitting, because it was a rant video. Like, I was quite pissed off when I made it, because I was made to feel like I don't have the right to judge an author or a book that was written hundreds of years ago, because society lived by different rules at that time and had different values. So like, what gives me the right? And like, well, what gives me the right? What gives me the right is because I'm a reader, and I have the right to express my feelings about a book, whether it's considered a classic or not. Because yes, society's values change over time, but there are expressions of sexism like violence against women being presented as humor, and figures in authority abusing that power and sexually molesting children and adolescents, and that was wrong hundreds of years ago, and it's wrong today. And yes, it still happens today, and thank God our consciousness is slowly evolving as a society so that we can recognize that there's different levels of sexism which exist. But oppression is oppression, and it's only our ability to recognize it as oppression which changes. But I would emphasize that I do think that the Decameron and any other problematic classic are still valuable pieces of literature and worth reading, but we should be open to discussing its problematic nature. So I'll give you another example, like a contemporary example of a book that was published recently, which is very problematic. A poetry collection by James Franco titled Straight James / Gay James. This is a book from 2015, and I need to do like a full review of this book, I think, sometimes to get in the ways it's so prejudiced and the ways it's so hilariously bad. And Franco probably wrote it as some like metafictional experiment or like commentary on poetry, but I don't care. The central premise that his aesthetic is gay, but in bed he's straight, is so offensive. It's deeply insulting to be like, I'm gay in my mind, but in the sheets I'm a real player. So yes, there are different levels of homophobia and sexism and racism. It's not all clear cut, and that's partly what makes literature so compelling and interesting. But sometimes when literature is so unaware of its own prejudice, it needs to be called out. So I've been going on too long now, but let me know your thoughts on negative reviews, and like, has there ever been a negative review you've read that has actually pushed you to read a book because you're just so curious to like see how these bad things about the books manifest itself in the actual text? That would be fascinating to know. But also, like, do you think I should be more like scathing or critical in my reviews of books? Should I make videos about books I don't finish? And there's some books that I'll read like 20 or 30 or 50 pages of it and just find that it's not a book for me, and I'll put it aside. But usually I just don't feel motivated to talk about it. I'd rather talk about books that I'm really excited about. It's usually only if a book has really gone wrong that like I feel the need to give a negative response to it. Or if a book has been up for a prize or been really popular, then, you know, I think that makes the book more fair game to be negative about, or to give a more critical critique of that book. Also, have you ever read a book that you've liked or even loved, and then read a negative review of it, and it's totally changed your opinion of that book? Like, partly why I love the booktube community is that you get so many different opinions about books, that you find that it can really like modify and change how you think about book and see things that you didn't see there before. And it can sort of take you out of that deeply personal response that we have to books to see it a bit more objectively. There's so many more interesting questions about this, or thoughts that I have about all of these subjects, but I'm gonna stop for now. But thank you for watching, and I hope that whatever you're reading, whether you love it or hate it, you're enjoying the reading experience. So thanks for watching. I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.